and gentlemen, those who decided to join our expert discussion, the new approaches to population aging measurement. We have one presentation that will be made by Sergei Sherbov, who is a head of an international lab for demographics and human capital at the Presidential Academy. The presentation is available at a website, and now we are going to get the full version. On the panel, we have Alexander Surinov, the head of the Federal Statistics Service, Tatiana Maleva, the director of Institute of Social Analysis at the Academy. We are also going to be joined by Professor Asghar Zaidi, professor at Southampton University, and Anton Kotekov, Deputy Minister of Finance. So we start, and we are now going to take a 30-minute presentation from Sergei Sherbov. Good morning, and thank you very much for coming to this session. I have my charts in English, but the presentation will be made in Russian. The title of presentation is Aging in Russia and the World, a New Look into the Old Problem. Things that I'm going to cover are fairly new, although the roots go back about 10 years. Last year at Gaidar Forum, I have spoken about this subject, and I am going to repeat a few of my old statements to give you the big picture. The main idea is that we look at aging not simply as at a chronological age, when people turn from young into old. We look at several indicators. This work has been done by me together with Professor Sanderson. We have been working together for 12 years. I am going to start by talking about conventional definitions of aging, new measures of age and aging. We will look at the overall trends in various parts of the world, and we will also look at aging in Russia, following which I will make a few conclusions. We have to first define aging. The general definition is as follows. Population aging is the process by which older individuals become proportionally larger share of the total population. That is the definition of the United Nations. There is another popular way of defining aging, or rather, way of measuring aging. There is so-called median age. Half of the population is younger, half of the population is older than the median age. There is yet another measure, which is also very popular. That is old age dependency ratio. Many journals and magazines like Wall Street Journal and The Economist today say that we are looking at a bomb that is about to explode, and they would usually refer to this old age dependency ratio. But then again, who is old? According to the UN, people over 60 years of age are old people. In most European organizations, people who are 65 years and older are considered to be old. In Russia, it's 55 for women and 60 for men. No matter where that borderline is, it is always fixed. This is an abstract from Population Aging report by the UN. They have this statement that population over 60 years of age is going to more than double by 2050 and more than triple by the 2100. These are UN curves showing median age. It's growing indeed. You see the historic data and the forecasts. These are curves for different parts of the world. And this is the old age dependency ratio. In Europe, it has grown by 5 times, or at least it has quadrupled. This chart is one of my favorites. Here you can see the record for oldest male summiter of Everest. In 1953, the oldest man who came up the Everest was 39. In 2013, it was a much older person. Of course, today we have better equipment and hardware, but people are also changing. We can no longer say that a person who is 60 years of age is the same as a 60-year-old in 100 years from today or 100 years ago. This made me and my colleague think about the new measures of aging. I want to spend some time talking about other indicators that can be used and that can be an alternative to median age. There's a lot of publications on the subject of aging, and we see a lot of new concepts. A 60-year-old man, is he an old man or is he a young man? It depends. It depends on the audience that you're speaking to. If you talk to school children, they will tell you that this is an old man. Well, today most people would assume that a 60-year-old is a middle-aged person. 100 years ago, this would be a very old man. Why so? Because today in Europe, most people, 93% of the people make it to the age of 60. 150 years ago, only 25% of the population made it to the age of 60. So this measure, life expectancy, is what is telling us whether a person is old or not. Traditional measure or traditional age, that is an indicator that is retrospective in nature. It tells us how long people have lived, and it has little to do with life expectancy. And young and old concepts depend on life expectancy. In 2005 and in 2010, we introduced a new notion of prospective age. This was the beginning. Why we were interested in this concept. Many decisions that people make in life, investment decisions, a decision to study or a decision to buy property, depends on people's idea of how long they're going to live. 100 years ago, nobody would go to university at the age of 50 or 55. Today, this is happening a lot, quite frequently in the West. Today, people at the age of 70 would buy a house because they expect to live longer. This prospective age measures how old people are, not only from the date of their birth, but also in other ways. So there is a chronological age, and there is a prospective age. People can have the same chronological age, and people who have the same prospective age have the same number of years left. This is similar to currencies and inflation. We measure prices using the value of a currency in a certain year. Let's say a dollar of 1960. We have to find a reference year, and then we would look at that standard year. Then we would look at a 40-year-old or at a 50-year-old. What is a life expectancy for a 50-year-old? And then we would see in which year people would have that life expectancy. This constant prospective age is 40. This is data for China. This is the standard of 1950. Let's look at 40-year-olds, females and males. Prospective age and remaining life expectancy was 25.5 and 22.5 for females and males. So they had the same prospective age. If we look at 1950 as the standard year, we can identify their standard age. If that is clear, then these curves should also be clear to you. This is China, males. These curves, 50, 40, 60. In 2013, we looked at the expected life expectancy of a 40-year-old, and then we see in which age groups people had this remaining life expectancy or life expectancy at birth. In 2010, 40-year-olds were the same as 30-year-olds in 1970 in China. The same is true for Brazil. They have very high growth in life expectancy. So their 40-year-olds today are like 28-year-olds of 1970. In Russia, it's different. We have seen periods when population was aging faster, and 40-year-olds were like 43-year-olds of 1970. So we have the standard age. Now let us look at aging per se, in the past and in the future. We can use this concept of prospective age to the median age. We would measure median age at every point in time, and then we would do a comparison to reference years. We standardize median age. This is data for Switzerland. This blue curve shows traditional median age, and in red you see prospective median age. You see that there is no aging. In fact, the population is getting younger. However, it all depends on the standard year. The level is not important. It's the dynamics that matter. This is the picture for England and Wales. You again see that the population is getting younger. Of course, things depend on death rate. This is the curve for the entire world. Our approach is now used by the United Nations. In their aging report, they started using our parameters. So I guess many statistics offices, national statistics, agencies are going to start using these indicators. You see median age and prospective median age. Here again, it's not important what the level is, but the dynamics. You can see that in some regions, there's no change in median age between 1960 and 2050. These are BRICS countries. I have recently made a presentation in China on BRICS country situation. Look at Russia. The pointer doesn't seem to be working. This is a curve for Russia. In 2000, median age was the same as we are going to say in 2050. So there's really no aging. So far, we talked about median age and equivalence. Now, let us look at the share of older people. This is a traditional picture for OECD, 65 plus. This share is growing between 1900 and 2015. Now, let us look at life expectancy at age 65. We see that it is growing too. Now, in the 1970s, life expectancy was about 15 years. This was an aggregated number for OECD countries. Let's remember this number, 15. In 1960s, 60-year-olds were considered to be elderly people. They had 15 years left. Now, let us look at different years. You can see the years in which remaining life expectancy was 15 years. In 1980s, 65-year-olds were considered to be elderly people. They had 15 years left, 15 years or less. Let us remember that and now look at the changing share of people who have the life expectancy of 15 years or less. This is the curve. So if we use a different angle, you can see that the dynamic border of old age is different, and there is really no aging. If we look at a historic period now, let us look at the forecasts. This covers the entire world. The dynamics are quite different in different parts of the world. These are BRICS countries. Very similar. You can see that the level of aging is much lower. This is what people use most of the time. This is the old age dependency ratio. The difference is tremendous. You can see traditional curves on the left-hand side and prospective old age dependency ratio on the right-hand side. The old age frontier is moved. So these are the BRIC countries' curves. In 1960, or Russia in year 2000 would demonstrate the same picture as in 2050. This is China. It again shows very similar numbers as in 2060. This is another interesting picture based on the UN data. The United Nations make traditional forecasts, and they also have a probability forecast. We were amongst the first people who were building such probability reports. Today, the United Nations do this too. What makes it interesting? Let us use China as an example. On the left-hand side, you can see old age dependency ratio, and on the right-hand side, you can see prospective old age dependency ratio. You can see the spread. You can see the range. It's all probabilities. You can get as high as 95% of probability. You can see that the old age dependency is very different. Besides, the level of uncertainty is much smaller if we are to look at prospective old age dependency ratio. We are saying that people become old not at the age of 65, but when they have remaining life expectancy of less than 15 years. Now the question is, who is really old? We have looked at 3 years, 1980, 2015, and 2050. We see that in most countries, we have looked at a few countries that have been taken for this test. We see that in 1980, 65-year-olds were all old. Their remaining life expectancy was less than 15 years. In 2015, there are countries like Brazil, for example, where 60% of the population would fall into the old category. The rest of them, and that is more than 40%, would have remaining life expectancy greater than 15 years. The same is true for Japan, for France, and a number of other countries in the Republic of Korea. Less than 60% of the 60-year-olds would be considered old. Look at Russia. Life expectancy is not great now. In 2015, not everybody above 65 would fall into the old category. This is an interesting chart, prospective age 60 with a Japanese standard. In the upper part, you see males, and in the lower part of the chart, you can see females. In every country, we look at 60-year-olds, the prospective age, and we use Japan as standard, Japanese men and Japanese women in different years. I'm going to show you how we make this calculation. Let us look at France. French men at the age of 60, their life expectancy was the same as for Japanese men at the age of 59. So the French men were aging 1 year faster than the Japanese. Now they are at the same level. You can look at China. In the past, 60-year-old Chinese man would correspond to a 68-year-old Japanese man. Now he would correspond to a 60-year-old Japanese man. So the Chinese age faster than the Japanese. Now let us look at Russia. Russian men in the 60s were aging at the same rate as Japanese men. 60-year-old men had remaining life expectancy that was the same as for 60-year-old men in Japan. Now, a 70-year-old man has the same life expectancy. A 60-year-old man in Russia has the same life expectancy as a 70-year-old in Japan. Now let us look at women. We used to have a slower aging rate in 1960 comparing to Japanese women. Now, Russian women age faster than Japanese women. We can use this parameter of prospective age to compare the aging rate, why we are aging faster. It all depends on the life expectancy at birth. We have regional data. You see a very significant spread in numbers. In Ingushetia or in Moscow, it's 22. In Tuva, it's only 13. What is this? How does this compare to the rest of the world? We have regions where life expectancy at birth is the same as in Europe. You can look at women. Ingushetia is similar to Sweden. Moscow is similar to Malta, which is not bad. Now, if we look at men, in Gush Republic, it would be similar to Ireland. But in a Jewish autonomous region, the rates are similar to what we see in Sierra Leone, which is the worst in the world. We see that Russia shows a very high level of diversity. There are regions that show very high standards, and this gives us certain hope that we can change for the better. This is another interesting indicator that is easy to calculate. That is probability for men of 40 years of age to live to the age of 65. You can see where we are in this table. The probability of a 40-year-old man to make it to 65 is about 63% in Russia. In China, that is 86%. In Germany, that is 86%. This shows, again, a serious regional inequality. This is another table that shows the probability that a 40-year-old man would make it to the age of 65 in 2015. We see some regions that are on a par with Europe and some regions that show very poor numbers. Now, the old age threshold. We have said that we assume that we would call a person with the remaining life expectancy of less than 15 years to be old. In Moscow, the threshold is 71 to 73. In Tuva Republic or in Chukotka, that level is 10 years older. So women in Tuva would essentially be 10 years older. For men, it's even worse, because here you see the difference of 14 years, 13.5 years. The old age threshold is 56 years for them versus 70-something in Moscow. If we call someone an old man, we can then measure the share of old people. This is the share of women older than 55 and men older than 60. You can see very different numbers. The biggest difference is in Tula region, and Chechen Republic shows about 10. Now, you can also see that when we use more reasonable parameters, not just that threshold of 55 and 60 years for women and men. We see that the numbers look much better. This is another chart
for demographic load of old age people. You see the numbers 25 to 55. In Tula, it's almost 60%. On the other hand, if we take the prospective old age dependency ratio, then it's 2.5 times less. This slide, I tried to do the same on this slide like we had for Japan. Remember that slide for Japan, how countries compare to Japan. This is our regions comparing to Moscow. Say the age is 60 years, prospective age 60, and what is life expectancy in a particular region? We'll see in which age is the life expectancy equal to 60 years in Moscow. In Ingushetia, a 60-year-old man would have the same life expectancy like in Moscow. On the other hand, if we take Jewish or Tuva, they become older 15 years earlier than Moscow. A 60-year-old man in Tuva have the same life expectancy as 72-year-old in Moscow. This is the speed of aging. That's how we can compare the speeds of aging in different regions. This is the same for women. It's not that much diversity, not that big a spread in the case of women, but also the situation is very diverse. And here we have this. It's something what corresponds to pension age. I didn't know how to call this slide. We call it alpha ages, but it's a long story to explain what it means. But roughly it's this. We make this calculation. Men retirement age is 60 in this country. And let's compare this against, well, the proportion of people in Russia as a whole, how many people pension age, and their proportion to, or the number of man years in pension age after 60, and from 20 to 60 age bracket. And then we check what should be the age in different regions to fully correspond to this proportion average for Russian. What happens then in Moscow? To achieve the same proportion, people should have work until 65, until retirement. But Tuva, it's only men, it's not people, it's men. And Tuva until 56.4. Clear, right? And the same for women. It's a little bit less heterogeneity, but in Ingushetia, well, in Russia it's 55, retirement in Moscow it's 57, so similar proportion. Coming to conclusions here. So the key messages is that the population is going to be aging, but don't overestimate aging. If you lose wrong premises, it's a very multifaceted, multidimensional process. Aging is not simply chronological age. We should consider a physiological condition, mental condition of people. We should consider the whole spectrum characterizing people. Only then can we come to reasonable conclusions about aging. And for various industries, for various occupations, that should be also differing. So the main conclusion here is that this index criterion, pure age, doesn't work. because we are comparing people who lived 100 years ago or people who will live 100 years into the future. These are different people. The characteristics are different. Health is different. Mental characteristics different. And territorially different. 60-year-old woman in Japan or Burkina Faso, they are different. That's what doing the United Nations right now. Most statistical agencies, they put everything into one heap, but that's not the right approach. And the approach I described here is just the very start of what we are going to do. We compiled a demographic list on aging a few days ago, and there will be some reference to this work on that list. But the very approach can be used on a broader scale too. You can compare. You can do surveys. You're doing various characteristics of people, like strength of arm, ideal that can be used to come to the single denominator, but the main strength of this holistic approach. Well, we're using only life expectancy here, but we can use very many criteria, like strength of arms or subjective evaluation of health. And using those characteristics, we can apply to age. We can average them. We can do lots of things with them. But of course, data should be reliable. And for data, we rely on the statistics agency. We need good quality data. To be able to manage, you need to measure. Without measurement, we can do nothing. So we need good data for surveys, current statistics. We need good data to know what's happening with our population. And finally, population aging, what I mentioned already. The latest report on aging from the UN, and they're using this new approach. And this is a demographic data sheet that I'm going to put on the table here. Everything's inside there, including reference to our website in the data sheet. Where can you read more if you're interested? Thank you. Thank you, Sergey, for this report. You referenced last year's report when we presented the Russian demographic data sheet. You would recall, if you were there, 2016. Natalia was moderating that session a year ago. And if you worked that data sheet, you will know that we had the calculations for aging thresholds in Russia, not only chronological aging, but also prospective aging. And we see fundamental change in approach here. We see very interesting comparisons against other countries here in this particular report. Okay, I thought you would do that at the end of the session. Right, but you want to grab the data sheet right now. The number of copies is limited, and it's already out. If you're interested, there's a reference there. You can go to the website with all of that data in printed format here. You can see, get online. Yeah, just use that link. The link from the institute. Yes, okay. So this is a good basis for the discussion on this new dimension in the measurement of aging. And we have several experts participating, in particular Mr. Surin of statistical agencies, who provide good quality data for us. The organizers of the discussion suggested several questions to be discussed during the session, and they are quite relevant. I do hope that we will cover those issues, and maybe in your questions also you would help us address all of these subjects. And measuring aging is one of these questions. And also the impact on increased life expectancy on the demographic situation, the forecast of demographic structure of Russia and globally, age inflation, the term already used by Sergey, old age threshold, and how is it connected to our current pension age and the regional demographic situation in Russia. If you don't mind, unless you have any questions, clarification questions on the previous presentation, then we go to the experts for their presentations. My name is Anatoly Rabinovich, and I'm General Director of National Pension Association. I have 3 clarification points. Me, being a young person, maybe, do I understand it correctly that today genetics is not a factor, or genes is not a factor which influences life expectancy much? That was one. Second point. In your data, well, I didn't see a slide of women and men 60 to 65 years, what would be their life expectancy to live until 80 or 90? And my third, the main one, we're in Russia, we're discussing the future pension system in Russia. Now, those regional factors that you mentioned in your presentation, how important is it in making the decisions, in making the analysis to make a decision whether to increase pension age or other issues associated with pensions and retirements, considering the differences between various regions of Russia? Thank you. Yeah, I asked you to make clarification questions. Some of your questions are not exactly that, but still we'll try to address them. Sergey? On the genes. Of course, the genes play a role, but the environment also plays a role. Behavior also plays a role in life expectancies. And all of these factors make an impact, of course, internal and external factors. Now, what were the other questions? 60, 65, what is the life expectancy or probability to live until 80 or 85? Well, this can be calculated very easily. We have that in the data sheet for Russia, and more will be in our site. We'll have a new data sheet there. Very easy to calculate based on the statistics we get from the Rosstat statistical agency. And all those probabilities are easily computable. In the data sheet for Russia, we have those age thresholds, life expectancies at various ages, all of that contained in the data sheet. And on that regional dimension, probably Tatiana is the best person to answer that question. She is, it is her part of business, pension reform, etc. I'm amateurish in this. I'm doing nothing about pension system. We have articles of how to calculate the right pension age, the generation equitable pension age. It's clearly, well, it should be based on prospective old age dependency calculations. This is computable. But the issue is then, can we have different pension ages in different regions? We can use some coefficients to adapt for specificities in various regions now. We can easily calculate what the coefficient should be, increasing pension age in a particular region, to even out the difference in life expectancies between various regions. But is it reasonable to do on a national scale? I don't know. Thank you. Well, I hope we don't have any more questions to Sergey about what the pension age should be. Only clarification questions, please. Sergey, previous session, there was an opinion expressed that by year 2050, the average working age would be 90 to 95 years. Have you heard about this? What's your viewpoint on that? I heard worse. There's a British gentleman by the name of Gray. He said that younger people right now, some of them would not make it to 1,000 years. But that's science fiction. There was a lot of research, biodemographers, biobiologists, specialists in aging. Well, the limit for life expectancy is around 120 years. That's the majority of experts agree on that. Some people say a little more, some people say a little less, but the average 120. And life expectancy was increasing always quicker than the expectations of experts. Some 10 years ago, there was an article in Science magazine about, and I'm saying precisely this, that experts are always more conservative in their forecasts about how life expectancy is going to grow over years into the future. One last clarification question, please. And please referring to Mr. Sherba's presentation. Thank you, Sergey, for this very interesting report. Based on pension calculations, you used 65 and 15 years ago life expectations at 65. So you were talking about aging of the population. But if we take 80 years rather than 65 or 90 years, the picture may be reversed then between different countries, because it's Lombard's function there. We see the density of the probability of death at smaller age as a bigger dispersion, which means that record life expectancies that we had in previous centuries, where there was huge dispersion, and that was possible. And what Mr. Gray says, as biologists, he takes it very simple. There's cancer cells that live beyond the life of the body, etc. So what Oppen and Woppel wrote, that was about average life expectancy that continues to grow, but until 86 never reaches the ultimate threshold. So the question is, what you're doing is helpful for the pension fund. You can calculate the minimal old-age dependency ratio, but it's not feasible in the current situation, considering what I said already. Well, to be brief in my answer, using the algorithm that you mentioned, it's not life expectancy, it's life course ratio rather than TX. What Germany, England, Sweden, they all follow this trajectory, and this can be used. They are following that trajectory exactly. Thank you. Now let's move on to discussion, and before I give the floor to Alexander Surinov, I have an intro of sorts. What you're producing. There was a question today. If you look at the plan of Rostat publication, you would see that by the end of the year, they would have a demographic fact share, and that would be issued once every 2 years. But that was issued exactly on the date when it was in the plans of Rostat. If we take mortality tables, life expectancy tables, you'll see the answers to your questions and other questions. Expectations for women at the age of 65, 68. For women 60 years, it's 16 plus years expectancy. And if you're interested in 80 years, what is the life expectancy? Make that calculation yourself based on those tables. But now I give the floor to Alexander. Thank you. Before I make my presentation, I'd like to thank Sergey for an interesting report. I have many questions to your report. Well, because I'm in this profession, numbers, like accountants. So to be able to count something, you need to define things properly. Well, you said women in Tuva become older earlier than in other regions. But we need to be clear about terminology here so that everybody understands what is meant here. And there was another question about using average or median life expectancy. When we measure or evaluate the density of income distribution of the population, we are not using median, we're using mode, because the dispersion is very high, considering that our country is big. And you saw a big differentiation in terms of life expectancy between the regions. And inside the regions, there's also dispersion. It could be Krasnoyarsk city or northern Krasnoyarsk territory or Moscow area around Moscow. Life expectancy also would be different. But again, that's a challenge that we feel there is in your report. A lot depends on the quality of information, of course. We're using surveys. It's quite expensive. Censuses quite expensive and not very well taken by contemporary society, because you, as respondents, well, it's like your obligation. You have to answer those questions. And like other countries, we don't like any obligations. And this is voluntary. You may decide for yourself that you want to ask those questions. We started preparation for the census of 2020. Just a few words to share this information to you. We're planning to use various methods of collecting data on the population. The traditional methods, the most reliable ones, were invented back in ancient Rome. It's face-to-face, asking questions in personal interviews. But we want to use the internet because the new law on census allows doing that. We'll use other methods to collect information. We will use POADR. The experience of the recent agricultural census 2015 shows that Russia is nothing different from other countries. That saves money. If you use iPad census, we'll use the portal of state services. We're planning to use that to have this service to the population so that people can provide data on themselves through the internet. We expect our census to be in 2 stages. First 10 days using the internet. And after that, a second wave. We start face-to-face visits or invite people. We go to their households or ask them to visit our centers. This one shows how it is going to be done, this slide. Well, you probably know that the register of population is now being compiled in Russia. And we want to use this register of population in the census, but the very roadmap and some issues that remain outstanding, unfortunately, will not be able to use that register in 2020. Maybe in 2025, where we have quite a bit of data in that register. The micro-census, the older ones in USSR and the recent Russia covered only 5% of the population, but that was good enough to get more or less reliable data on many indicators. The most recent micro-census was only 1.5%. That was, of course, not that much information. But 2030, we are going to use this resource. Why am I saying this? Because some people are not happy with the results of census. Back in the Soviet times, that was not voiced out very loudly. But in all countries, well, people are quite critical about the results of census. And as a result of this comparing census of the population, the results, the national ones are compared against data that are available from other sources. And it's very important to make sure that the data we obtain from the census is comparable or compliant with other sources of data. We call that administrative sources of data. In this respect, the register of population is going to help us to iron out all those differences between the census data and other sources of data. And the results of census used for the budget, to prepare the budget, and imagine what kind of pressure that we're getting from local authorities. They want to have more people allocated to them, and this is an important factor, the pressure from local authorities affecting the quality of census. A trial census we'll do this year. We are building a working group right now to do that process from the ministries, from experts. 550,000 people would be covered. We'll use the possibilities of the post of Russia. In our previous efforts, we tried to use them, but that was not very efficient. But still, we're going to continue using the posts of Russia. This is pilot project covering Moscow, St. Petersburg, because traditionally those two cities are the hardest to cover by census. Hard to reach regions will also be covered to check on whether internet is effective there or post office effective there. Also, rural areas would be covered, other cities would be covered, a variety of municipalities and areas in terms of income distribution, geographical location, etc. That is going to be a trial census. What's important for us during this trial census will give an opportunity, at least we're planning to that, will provide an opportunity to all population of Russia to use the internet voluntarily, to provide information about themselves. We want to check the capacity of that portal, state services, government services, whether they can, it is sufficient for that. Because the experience of other countries who used the internet for census, the experience was not always good. That could be a tax on the side, but sometimes simply this capacity of the system was not sufficient to handle all of that information. There were technological constraints for that. There was a serious attack against the Australian Bureau of Statistics. For several days, they couldn't do anything about that. But they conducted that census through the internet. What could be the effects of this census? We expect that we should cover at least 10% of the population with the census. The percentage varies with the different countries. Some countries with a reliable national statistics system, with high penetration of internet and IT, they produce lower percentage in coverage. But our neighbors, Estonia, census 2010, they covered 70 or 80% of the population with internet census. And Russia, if every region covers 70% of the population, we achieve 70% average for Russia. But it's difficult to identify any particular factor that affects how active people are in using internet to provide information about themselves. But IT's penetration is increasing, so we may reach more than 10% in terms of census coverage with the internet. And the census of this year, the trial census, will show what can be expected there. In addition to censuses, which give general characteristics about the population, because the census lists is restricted, every question costs money, and in Russia, the past two major censuses, we had to hire 40,000 people, 2 days of training for 400,000 people. Imagine, it's very difficult to train them properly. That's an exam after that, etc. So it's a costly business. We always had arguments with experts what kind of questions to put, and the list of questions should be limited because of that constraint. And also, we're going to get information through the internet, through pads, and on paper. In addition to that, we have such things. A poller would visit households. We also invite people to special centers, census centers, and some people wouldn't want to go. All of that may affect the results of the census, because, well, depending on the method used to collect data, and sociologists know that affect the quality of information. And we will think twice of what questions to put on the census list to make that as simple as possible. But of course, we need information from analysts, for demographers who do their modeling and scenarios. So over the past several years, we have had a system of selective surveys for socio-demographic problems. You see one of the title one of that survey and the type of information we obtained from that survey. We normally have two major surveys. One is labor force, done in Russia since '92.
We covered 65,000 people every month. This was a very large-scale review. And another traditional review that we've been doing since 1950. There is a traditional review, things that we are proud of, like standard rations. Several countries do this. We wish we could raise funding to do a survey of use of narcotics, and we would also like to do a survey on crime rates. Those are the kinds of surveys that are recommended by the United Nations, and we have done some measurements. People are willing to share information of that type. Those are the things that help better understand how people live, and that is true for people of different ages. What is the threshold for old age? You can make that decision without us, but we would like to give you as much information about the population as possible. Just to give you some extra information, this chart shows you the overall number of respondents for our surveys. You can see that the numbers are very impressive. 2 million respondents in 2022. This is the scale of information that we are collecting on a regular basis. In some years, we do annual surveys. Some surveys are done on a quarterly basis. Some surveys are only conducted once in 5 years. We do this for a reason. We are also trying to get reliable information on a regional basis. We do not have a huge budget. We cannot get super high quality at a regional level. We sometimes do smaller research and smaller surveys to get more in-depth understanding. These are some areas of analysis that we do. All this information is available at our websites. We have databases. We publish a lot of tables. This gives you plenty of data to work with. Not all experts are happy with the data we present. Some people want to get access to raw data, but we do not grant access to that data. We process all information that we publish. The data that we publish is formal, it's official. That's essentially all I wanted to share within this short time that I was given. I hope this is helpful in your studies of population aging. We are open for suggestions. If you have any thoughts on new types of analysis, please share that with us. I also want to say thank you to Sergei Sherbov for his presentation. He produces a lot of high-quality publications on various statistical subjects. Thank you. We have time for maybe one question, or we can take the next step and continue the discussion. Thank you very much for your information. Thank you for sharing the prospects that we have in getting information on fertility, on mortality, on various other indicators. You probably realize that the issues we're facing are quite challenging. I hope we will get more accurate, more precise data. We know that we have yet another presentation, or in fact, two presentations. Tatiana Maleva. Last year, Tatiana was the moderator of the demographic session. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Valery. Ladies and gentlemen, I do have a presentation. I would like to share it with you without going into in-depth calculations. The issue of population aging is not a new one. It has been in the focal point of scholars for a very long time. We have seen different approaches and attitudes to this issue. The population aging raises a lot of interest. The angle presented by Sergei Sherbov is very interesting. Prospective age is an interesting methodology. We see that this prospective age is showing high level of elasticity. Different times, different age groups, very interesting potential. The subject of aging has been discussed at length by the social studies experts. The challenge is very serious for the society. We are anticipating the census, and we expect to see more elderly people. There's one thing that people realize very slowly. That is that the aging of the population and changes in demographic structure of the population present a new challenge to social institutions in the country. The social arrangements that have acquired shape 100 years ago are still around. However, now we are coming close to the time when people will live 100 years, and the society cannot keep the old system of social benefits. The system that goes back to the period of first industrial revolution. That's when we saw the launch of first pension systems. We have to adapt to the new challenges because now we are using the pension system that goes back to the beginning of the industrial revolution that we have had in 1930s in this country. We have made huge progress since then in terms of demographics. It's not just that I've been in this field for a long time and I could share a lot of calculations that will upset you greatly. If we are to support the innovative scenario of the pension system reform, today the replacement factor is about 36%, but then again, 36% of low wages will not please anyone. We're not talking about 2,000 euro. We're talking about 40,000 rubles, which is the average wage. 36% is not satisfactory pension for anyone. But that's not all. By the end of 1930s, we may see 28% or even 25%. So pensions may amount to only 25% of an average wage level in the country. Economic and fiscal motives for change are quite obvious. I would like to change gears now and talk about something else. Sergei's presentation is telling us that there are serious demographic changes going on around us. All governments assume certain social commitments. If you look at different pension systems, you will notice that all pension systems have been designed in such a way that they are not linked to life expectancy. All pension systems have been linked to the financial capabilities of governments. First, pensions have been offered for people reaching the age of 70 against the backdrop of average life expectancy of 45. We now live differently. I have been in this business for a very long time, and we have been talking about raising the retirement age for more than 20 years, and it still has not happened. I remember an article about the need to raise a retirement age back in 1997, and nothing has changed since then. People live different. People's lives are different. If you look at the history of the Soviet pension system, you will see this. What were the conditions that we had at the time when the system was built? Life expectancy for men was 43, and for women it was 46, and retirement age was 55 and 60 for women and men. So even then, the retirement age was much higher than the real life expectancy. At the same time, let us look at the life cycle. That is an important point in Sergei's presentation. The quality of life has changed significantly. In 1930s, when the pension system was built, most people entered labor market at the age of 14. Remember, 7 years of high school, and then people would enter labor market at the age of 14. The upper threshold was 60. If you do simple math, you will see that a man would be in the labor market for 45 years and a woman would be in the labor market for 40 years. With that duration of employment, a solidary pension system would work. Things have changed, though. And back then, by the way, people would work 6 days a week. If people were to work like that, we could support a Pillar 1 system. Today, we see a different picture. People spend much more time in school. In the past, people would enter the working life at the age of 15. Now that comes much later. Also, when pension systems were built, we had one single retirement age for all. When it was established, we have seen that the early retirement practices were introduced, and that was available to many groups of citizens. So an effective retirement age was lower than the official. For women, it was 52, and for men, it was 54. So that's what we should base our maths on. For females, a pension system was based on a 40-year long employment. Today, we have reduced that number by 13 years, and you can do easy calculation to see that the picture is the same for males. We need a shift. We need a shift. Theoretically, this is a new challenge that we have to respond to. Things have been changing over 100 years. Industrial performance has been going up, so fewer people can support a greater number of older people. With new technologies, with high performance in the industry, more elderly people can be sustained. However, the society has not reached the level when a smaller number of younger people can support a greater number of older people. That is the first interesting theme. And I would say that we really do not have that many solutions to put together a socially acceptable pension system. There are essentially two ways out. Either we should raise taxes, and then the young people may protest because they will have to pay a much higher share of their income into the pension funds. The costs would be carried by the younger generation. They will get lower wages. Probably the young people will not appreciate that. The second option is to put up with continuous reduction of the pension size, or the third option is to change the ratio between the donors and beneficiaries of the pension system. And that, again, translates into raising retirement age. In the past, retirement age was completely different. People were doing hard physical work. And that certainly had an impact on the people. At 55 and at 60, people would no longer be able to work. We are now talking a lot about digital economy. It's about sitting in front of a computer, and it's really not physical labor, and the ability to work is really different. We may talk about the accepted, but whether or not it's acceptable to raise retirement age, whether or not it's ethical or not ethical. But people are really able to work longer. We see that fewer people leave employment when they reach retirement age. We may come to an interesting conclusion. Only 45% of the people really retire after they reach retirement age. Most people continue to work. How long they will continue to work? 1 year or 2 years, they may work until they reach the age of 90. Of course, if somebody works till the age of 80, we cannot make general assumptions based on that. But we see that most people will continue to work for another 2 or 5 years. Today, reaching retirement age does not mean that people are no longer able to continue to work. The nature of labor is changing, and these changes will continue. So what matters is people's attitude to this. It's not about physical ability or disability to work. Of course, if a person is disabled, then it's a different story. We know that there's a lot of research that's been done in the West. We have been trying to use many of those examples without much success, though. A lot of researchers in the West say that retirement has a negative impact on people's health. We would like to do a study of this type in Russia. Of course, it would require certain models to be developed. Another subject that I would like to cover is social arrangements, not just pensions. I could spend hours just talking about pensions, but there is something else that we do not appreciate enough, and that's also very relevant. This is the subject. Well, let me tell you a story first. The latest increase in pensions happened in early 2000s. The minimum pension could no longer be lower than a subsistence level. Then we brought pensions to a new high level. After that, we did not have any raises in pension level. The minister who was in charge of that reform, Tatiana Golikova, talked to us and asked us to help to understand why people were not happy. People got a raise of 2,000 or 3,000 against the backdrop of average wages. This was a significant increase, and the government had reasons to believe that people would be happy. However, people were not showing that. We analyzed that. We looked at people's attitude and how people saw their financial position. Younger retired people had higher opinion of this valorization. Who got more benefits? People in older ages, those people who had most of their employment in the Soviet time, people who were 80 years and older. At that age, people were looking for services more than they were looking for cash. People were needing medicines and care. When they got a raise of pensions that amounted to 3,000, this was not enough to address their support and healthcare needs. So older people had greater needs for support. Social support is what is important for them. We need to have a market of social services for elderly people. This market should be diversified. It should be done not only as a government-sponsored arrangement. We could have private organizations offering their contribution to this market. Of course, there are new expectations and new needs. When we understand that better, we may fix some of the problems that we're facing. The problem of poverty continues to be relevant. It has been relevant for 25 years. It's still high on our agenda. We know that poverty is a multidimensional thing. Different people lack different things. Different groups of people lack different things. When you look into it, you will see that when people are lacking money, it's about families with a large number of children. But there are other things. When you talk to people, you will see that they have different expectations. We have quite a lot of arrangements for families with children. We offer daycare groups, we offer kindergartens, and this thing and the other. And we see quite a lot of developments. We offer quite a lot for the children. However, people are not getting much more cash. Today, governments are trying to focus more on monetary transfers. It's different in the pension system. We are doing all we can to support the pension system. Older people, though, people over 80, say that they need social support in non-monetary form more than actual cash. We have to take that into account. We have to look at the government policies that could address those challenges. We have to be able to respond to this. Then the aging process will not be as severe as it can be if we do nothing. Population aging can be a negative thing, can be a challenge. It can translate into a serious extra burden for the active population. We have yet another presentation to take before we open the floor. Still, there's one question that I would like to pose for Tatiana. It's a question about the pension reform, should we take into account the difference in life expectancy between different parts of the country? I agree with many statements you made in your presentation, but we are at the Gaidar Forum, and we know that digital economy project should take this into account. Do you make any contribution to this development? Sergey has talked about prospective age. You have been talking about a life cycle. Is my understanding correct that in your strategy, prospective age has not been identified yet, and it has to address the opportunities that citizens should get to have a good, decent life? Well, I would rather start with the second part of the question. I will say that the Academy is participating in the studies and in the research. And now, on the subject of regional differences, I can tell you this. There are differences. However, we have a Pillar 1 pension system, a pay-as-you-go, and I don't know how we can introduce different retirement ages in different regions. We are a federation, and we all should have the same benefits, regardless of where we are. Again, we have a fairly mobile population. Over lifetime, people can move from one part of the country to another several times.
If pension ages are different by the region, people would simply migrate to where it's lower. Like the northern people of Siberia, they have very low life expectancy. Does it mean that in Nenets territory we should have a much lower pension age? No, this would not work. What we can do and what we have to do, we can take regions with the lower life expectancy. We should focus on those to try increase the lifespan in those regions, to even it out more or less, to create the same social and demographic possibilities. But again, we have a national system. It's a one system for all. We're a federal state. We cannot introduce some specific conditions for individual regions. But the amount of pensions, actually, and the size of the pensions, they take into account the specificities of each particular region, average wage, etc., etc. And your final question. Yes, that would be great if we use the methodology of prospective age. At this point in time, we're not using that. Sergei Sherbov talked about the demographic dimension. I was talking about the social support system, and we're using different methodology. Thank you. We have another speaker. After that, we have questions and answers. The remaining ones. Tatiana Klechko, Center for Economics of Continuous Education. This continuous education directly applies to the subject matter of this discussion. If we want to live longer, we want to be healthy longer, if we want to be able to work longer, then we get more interested in continuous education to improve our skills, to acquire new jobs, etc. This is one side to it. And the second, this could be one of those social institutions that Tatiana spoke about, not only providing care to older people, but to give new meaning to life in older age. Thank you. Thank you, Sergey, for a very interesting report. Had I heard it before, I would have made a different presentation. But I have what I have. and I'll try to highlight what I believe is important. This is educational processes comparing Russia against the USSR. And you see that, well, it was 100% of children going to grade 1, but now, out of people who come to grade 1, 40% go also to higher educational establishment. In the USSR, it was only 7.5% of first graders who would have higher education. This is great colossal change. This is a change that also contributes to the aging processes. In 1980, there was a so-called comprehensive program of scientific and research progress developed in the USSR, and improved well-being and the development of culture in the USSR were part of that program. And back then, we defined that 80% of jobs in the USSR were jobs manual or low-skilled labor. That meant that people became worn out by hard physical labor earlier, and the structure of education was reflective of that job situation. Higher productivity jobs, the lower manual labor jobs. It was only for 7.5% of the population. That determined the situation that people became older earlier, and that the contribution of all workers, they could be working for long years, but their contribution to GDP was low. And these 7.5% of people who had university education, some would go to postgraduate studies as well. Now, those were the most efficient, productive people, driving the growth of the country in those years. Well, space and many achievements were there. So that was the situation. 80% of the population work in hard labor, and produced very little to the GDP. And we need to be aware of that. That's why the pensions were low. And as a result, and we have this inheritance of pension age and low pensions. That comes from those old days. On the other hand, what Sergei showed us, the numbers, well, that could be a part of an interesting project if we consider in various regions how many people get higher education by region. How many people today, well, in Ingushetia, as a matter of fact, very many people who go to higher educational establishments, they do want to study, but they would not get back to their previous social lives. And while the Caucasian republics, North Caucasus, in terms of involvement or penetration of higher education, that region is growing faster than the rest of Russia, especially Central Russia. On the other hand, there's a lot of educational migration. Once we started with unified school exam, people started to migrate. Before, they would stay within their regions. They would believe that a good university, like we did a study in Perm region, they would tell us in the past that, well, best university, they would say, would be a Perm university. Only 1% would say that the Moscow State was the top university in Russia. Because they said so, because they didn't even consider Moscow State as potential educational establishment for themselves. Now it's different. They would say that the Moscow State is the top university, not the Perm University. The guys from Perm decided to go to Moscow. This is migration. Having studied in Moscow, they stay in Moscow. And that makes an impact on your demographic data. They are strong young people, mentally healthy young people, concentrate in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, and that makes an impact on demographics. And these regions may become younger, since very many young people come to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Ekaterinburg. And Moscow, especially cities nearby, like Ivanovo. Moscow is nearby. You can come there. You can live there. And this is the whole process, that physically and mentally healthy human capital migrates to Moscow and other centers, like what Mr. Kudrin spoke about today, about agglomeration, he mentioned. And a few more things. I call it continuous education. We call it this way, but our colleagues in the Rosstat agency, they use this term to define a different subject. But let me add this. It's about 20% covered by additional professional education, and we call it a continuous education. After 45 years of age, employees normally don't receive regular upgrade of skills. If we want to increase, though, the pension age, we should start retraining these people. They should be given more opportunity to have a new start in life, but not in this country. What we have, only 3 to 5% of people after 45 getting this refresher courses upgrade of skills. Normally, people doing intellectual work, and they have quite a few years ahead of them in their professional lives. 6 to 7% of people older than 65 years, they study individually on their own behalf. Healthcare and education, there are certain government regulations of how to retrain, upgrade the skills of those people. In these sectors, the situation is better on the one hand, but on the other, we have to retrain doctors every 3 years. The teachers every 3 years, and for doctors it's a continuous process, certification and recertification. But as a result, we have a very heavy structure. One of the ideologists of the educational system back in the 60s had a very famous paper published called The Crisis of Education. There, he writes that in 5 years, the teacher would build their own tracks of how to teach, and it's very difficult to move a teacher off that track. Now, we have an interesting situation. Children would tell us that teachers don't know life. We do our surveys about the efficiency of high schools. Kids would know gadgets and this new environment much better than the teacher. And they would tell us, the kids would tell us that we live in a reality, the teachers don't. So, on the one hand, those teachers, the teachers have long lives, working lives, 55, 60 years, and they have to be retrained. But we cannot move to a new educational system only because of that past and the gap between teachers and students, while we're being told there's digital economy, everything would be done from smart code, personal wizard would train your kids through smartphones. There's a story by Isaac Asimov. The plot of the story, there would be a button in the hand of a child. He would press the button and would get all the information they need in life. And one kid did not get that button. He wanted to be a commander of a spaceship, and he was not given a button. He's crying and seeing an adult, asking the adult, what are you going, why are you here? And the adult tells him, well, I've been told that you can become a human being, so a human being is going to train you, not a robot. This is very, very similar to what we have in our educational system. Education is from person to person, not from a smartphone to a person. And these are serious things. And the problem is not that we could have different pension age in different regions, although Tatiana said she could not accept that. But in terms of profession, we have different situations. In some cases, we had to make people retire to make sure younger people have better possibilities in a particular profession. Some other points. Saying that people live longer, work longer, and we need them to work even longer to make sure that they earn sufficient money to support them in old age. Like Mr. Kudrin said today, unless we increase the pension age soon, then transfers from the budget to pensions would kill off any investments into healthcare and education. But the point is that in those countries where education is for a fee, paid for, people work longer. And the situation becomes very interesting here. Well, I'm saying here that time spent in education increased to 25 or even 30 years in some cases. In Germany, people study for 25. They start their families longer. The kids also come about in older age. Although we are younger for longer periods of time, but there's a certain threshold beyond which it's difficult for women to give birth to kids. So as a result, we have all the ensuing demographic changes. And there's an interesting thing here. Here, I show some of information. There are the League universities in America. You have a look at the tuition fee in these universities. And families with retirement age parents, the pensions are good there, but still they have to borrow a lot of money to be able to pay for their kids. It's up to $50,000 per year, imagine. Multiply this by 6, you'll get the amount you have to procure to be able to have your kids, to give your kids a master's degree in America. It's 300,000, but add to that the catering and accommodation. Well, these are the leaders, of course. There are less expensive ones. But if you want to have a productive, good professional life, you will have to pay for it. You have to go to a good university. This is a little bit easier. This is Great Britain, not that heavy in terms of how much you have to pay in a university. And, I see it's like a money circulation in society, because if we work better, I don't. Well, there's a question mark whether we have to work longer. We have to work better rather than longer, because we have to earn, of course, healthcare, education, etc., etc. And to do a proper calculation with the increase in pension, how much would have to go through the budget to education and healthcare. Well, we need to be clear about what kind of numbers we're using there. Tatiana and Sergey, we have a lot of points in common, and in our work, by trying to show the demographic picture and the changes happening there. By using demographics, we can have a better three-dimensional picture of what is happening with society, with education, healthcare. Had there been a person here in healthcare business, that person would have made some more contribution to add to what we said here. Thank you. Thank you. Well, healthcare people wanted to participate in this discussion, but they have other sessions running simultaneously. So they had a choice, and they decided to choose in favor of other sessions. There are several people, in particular the head of the Department of Analysis and Forecast, but we were limited in that respect. We will have one question only, but there is a comment from Sergey before we do the question. To add to what Tatiana said, well, she spoke about the importance of education. Well, demographers right now, what we consider is normally age and gender as two main characteristics of a human being. But education gets more and more into the picture, like one of the basic characteristics of a person. Well, in some countries you can change gender, but once you get education, this is for your lifetime. And people are so much different in terms of education. The health would be different. The birth rate would be different. These are like two different planets. So education is a key characteristic of a person. Your question, please, yours offline. Next session starts immediately after ours. So thank you for participating. No more questions. Before coming here, one of my colleagues, economist and demographer, he says, I know what you're going to talk about, justifying increasing in pension age increase. Now, once we heard Sergey's report, we now know it's a research subject, and not only academic research on how to present age threshold, but there's a lot of possibilities for applied use of this research. Now, new emphasis in social policy, fighting death probabilities between 40 and 65, and being said that we're so much different from region to region. Should we now differentiate pension ages? But, and as we said, that wouldn't work. Because gender also is a different story. Women live longer in this country, but pension age for them is lower. But again, solidarity is very important. We're a nation, a federal country, and the pension age would be the same for all the regions. But there could be different benefits, and the activities would be taken in those regions where life expectancy is lower. So we need to reduce mortality rates where it is high to try bringing life expectancy up to world levels. Thank you.